Now. Welcome everyone. Can you raise your hand if this is your first growing up in science? Okay, I see a couple of hands. Awesome, great. Welcome in particular. So growing up in science is a series where scientists tell their honest life stories, life and career stories, and you learn what has been going on behind the scenes and more of the human narrative that we usually don't hear about when we hear scientific talks. But since the start of the pandemic, Yael and I have also been, and Vero, who's also here, have been organizing an online series where we alternate that format with themed meetings, often about mentorship related issues. And Yael has become, at least within the field, an expert on mentorship. She actually taught a course for faculty on how to become better mentors, which I took, and it was great. And she's been introducing some of those ideas also in the Growing Up in Science series, and we are witnessing one of those events here today. Without further ado, Yael.
Thank you, Weiji. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. Today is going to be very interactive. So I have very little prepared, in fact, 0 slides. I'm going to tell you about the problem solving technique. And then we're just going to try to solve some problems. And I will want you to participate either through the chat or through just speaking up. And also, I've made a little Google form if you want to raise some problems anonymously. I'll send a link for that shortly. But I wanted to start by introducing myself. So I'm Yael Niv. I'm professor of neuroscience and psychology at Princeton University, and I've been leading a lab for 12 years. Before that, I also worked in industry as a software engineer and leading a team of software engineers. So I've been kind of, problem solving for teams of people. I also am a mom to 2 kids who, problem solve for them too. So I've been problem solving for people for a long time, and for myself, of course. And at some point, maybe I want to say 10 years ago, I learned of this technique, which I'm going to tell you about today. I also want to say for faculty here, if there are faculty on this call, the course that Weiji mentioned, the mentoring course that Laura Murray, she's Dr. Laura Murray, she's at the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Princeton. She and I ran this course last summer for faculty. We are, or I am, I guess, going to run another version, not this academic year, but next academic year. So if you are interested, email me if you want to participate. That's a course for faculty at this point. Okay, so the problem solving technique. So what we're talking about today is situations, and okay, maybe I'll move one step back again. So Weiji said we've been running these mentoring themed growing up in science meetings maybe once a semester for, I guess by now it's a year and a half. And a lot of issues, and at some point we can, start from the start again because it's different people each time, but a lot of issues that come up are basically problems between mentors and mentees, between mentees and mentors, between mentee and mentee that they want their mentor to help solve, etc. And so what we're talking about today is one technique to deal with problems that are specific. So what I mean is not a problem like my mentor is toxic and I need to leave the lab, right? That's a different thing. We've talked about it many times. Sometimes leaving is the best option and the best solution. We're talking about smaller problems, but not tiny, not, I have a bug in my code, I don't know how to solve it. Something that's lingering and that you think could benefit from a type of a small intervention. And I say this because a problem solving technique, I've used it several times successfully. I don't recommend using it all the time. I think it's a kind of thing that works when you do it rarely, and kind of keep it for the special problems that are recurring and that you feel have grown to a point where they need some intervention. And I want to say before we dive into that, of course, all problems are better solved when they're small, before they grow and metastasize and ferment and things of that sort. But it's not always the case that we notice the problems when they're small. It might be that something kind of just, at some point we realize, oh my God, there's a pattern to what's been going on. It's been going on for a while. I couldn't name it before, but now I realize that there's a problem here. And I'll give you an example for a problem like that. For instance, I had a student in my lab a long time ago who was working on a project, and the project was slow. And also there were some bugs and some errors, and we ran an experiment and it turned out that there was an error, and we ran something else and there was a different error. And it's, each error is okay, there's an error, you find it, you correct it. But at some point you realize that there's a problem with this project. Something is not working well. And that was the first case in my lab when I thought, okay, let's use a problem solving technique here. So how does the technique work? It's really simple. It has three steps. The first step is to define the problem. It's just you sit with your mentor and say, I have a problem that I want us to work on. Or if you're the mentor, you sit with the mentee. So I sat with this student and I said, I have a problem that I think think there's a problem that we should kind of work on today in our one-on-one meeting. And you lay out the problem, you define it as well as you can. This is a really, really important part. Sometimes when you define the problem, it solves itself at that point. Maybe the other person didn't know there was a problem. Maybe as you're defining it and asking them what they think the problem is, they say it in a way that you didn't even know that. So this is actually the example that I gave before of this, the first time I wanted to use this technique in my lab. That's exactly what happened. I sat down with a student and I said, I think, let's look at this. And it's not like I have a problem with you. It's both of us have a problem. Let's look at the problem and try to solve it. So I said, I think, as I'm sure you are also aware, like this project has hit a lot of hurdles and it seems like there's some pattern here. What do you think is the problem? And then the student said to me, yeah, this project is actually really, really complex and I don't have programming background. And this needed a lot of programming. There's just like a lot of places for it to fail. And as we started talking about that, I realized, and we'd been working on this for like a year or two. And one, I'd forgotten that this student didn't have programming background because of their BA or whatever. I just didn't know that in that track, they don't learn to program. So first, bad on me to not realize that. And second, as we were talking about, I realized, oh, wow, this is actually the most complex project in the lab in terms of programming. And I gave it to the person who has no programming background. So at that point, there was no need for further intervention. There was more like, let's adjust, let's calibrate our expectations. Let's think, who can support you on the programming. Maybe you don't want to do this really complex project, but the student wanted to continue working on it. So like we were done at the point of defining the problem because I didn't even realize what was causing the problem. So that's to say defining the problem is really, really important. Let's say you define the problem and it has not solved itself yet. So now what you do in the problem solving technique is you just list any solution that comes to mind, even the craziest solutions. Someone else do the project for me. I totally stop this project. I leave my PhD, like anything that comes to mind. And knowing both of you at that point that like the fact that something finds itself to the long list of ideas does not mean it will at all be part of the short list of ideas. Like anything goes. And both sides throw out ideas and you write them all down. And then so it's basically brainstorming. And this part is really important because sometimes really creative ideas come up that, like, if you thought for yourself about solutions, you might not think of those. The other person can bring ideas, but also just as you throw out crazy ideas, that brings out crazy ideas from the other person too, crazy in a good way, right? Out of the box thinking. So it's important to put out some out of the box things, even though you know you're going to erase them later, because the third phase is now you erase stuff. And you can do it in turns, or you could just, I erase all of these, they're irrelevant. The other person erases all of those, they're irrelevant. And then slowly you narrow it down to a bunch of things that you might have not thought about to start with, that are relevant, that are useful. You can prioritize if there are several solutions, or choose which to start with first and see if it works. But often you'll have in your short list ideas that you didn't have before starting this whole conversation. And that's it. That's the famous problem solving technique. And it might seem really silly and trivial, but I can tell you again, like it works. It comes up with creative solutions. So what I want to do today for the rest of our time, and this might be a short growing up in science, depending on how many ideas you bring to the table, is solve some problems that you have in this way. Brainstorm all of us together. If you want to suggest, if you want to say your problem in the chat or raise your hand, we can do that. If you want to raise a problem anonymously, you can use this form. I'll answer Priscilla's question in a second. So you can use this form, the tinyurl.com, growing up in science, so GUIS problem solving. And if nothing comes up in the next minute while I'm answering Priscilla's question, I have a problem that we can start with, but I'm happy to, my problem is not that important. So why can't we use this technique all the time? What is the harm? So I don't know. I haven't used it all the time. I've used it rarely. I think this idea of getting us all in the mode of intervention and creative thinking would maybe stop working if we used it every day and on every little problem, but I don't have any data to support that, is the truth. But I kind of use it sparingly. The third step. So Amir is asking, what was this third step? So again, the steps are define the problem, brainstorm solutions, cross out. The third step is cross out the ones that are not necessarily irrelevant, that you just disagree with, that you don't think, that you don't want to do for any reason. And either party is allowed to cross off solutions. Hopefully, in the end, there are some that are not crossed off. I've never gotten to a point where in the end there is nothing left. But you don't need to explain why you're crossing things off. You can just cross off. This is a no, this is a no, this is a no. It's really important to write them all to start with before crossing them off, because again, there's something about writing down out of the box solutions, even if you know they're going to be crossed off, to kind of generate more creativity. And Chiara is saying, rightly so, that if the problem isn't specific enough, it's hard to brainstorm solutions because there's just too much space to wander around. And that's another reason why defining the problem is really important. So let me suggest a problem. Let me put a problem on the table.
Yeah, just a quick question. Did people submit anything by email to you?
People submitted a couple of problems by email that were not targeted to mentoring issues, because I think our call for problems was not specific enough.
All right.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. I have a problem that was raised here in the anonymous, as an anonymous problem. What I want to do, so we're going to have to kind of really define this problem well. I want all of you to contribute to defining this problem from your own experience as a similar problem has maybe raised itself to you. So the problem is a lab member who brings out a competitive lab dynamic, making it difficult to feel proud of one's work in the context of others' work. So can somebody kind of relate to that and try to elaborate on that problem? So someone, again, somebody in the lab who is making things competitive. So how does that affect your work? Let's define a problem here.
Maybe slightly, not exactly the same thing, but I know of people who, with the best intentions, probably always manage to direct the conversation towards their own previous papers, and that can make other people feel either annoyed or inferior.
So someone who's kind of always hogging the floor, maybe in a somewhat competitive way that makes you feel like if you raise, why does it not let me connect? Oh, I really wanted to connect AirPlay. Okay. Sorry. I think I'll have to give up on connecting my laptop. But what I can do instead is make a Google Doc and share that. Sorry, share screen and share this document. Okay, so we're talking about competitive problem. The problem, you see my Google Doc, right? Competitive lab member. Some more elaboration on that. Does anybody want to add information to this problem? See something in the chat. People are less inclined to share their failures and discuss them. And the original problem talked even about sharing successes. So this hampers communication about both successes.
Yeah, I like what Jiaqiu is saying. I'm making slow progress on my own project. There's this one guy who worked really well, and PI often uses them as a reference to push me. That's sort of the golden child model. It's super annoying. It's also very much Asian parenting, I think, but that's an aside.
What did you call this? Say it again. The
golden child, right? Like there's somebody who does everything right. Yeah.
I'm making this up a little bit. So the lab member who's competitive is also very successful. So often the yardstick to measure others. Okay. And Dylan is adding that this makes it hard to ask for advice. Because it makes you feel inferior, because it may be the question might be used against you. I'm going to write this in I'm the mentee bringing up the problem, so it hampers communication. So it makes me feel inferior. Me and others feel inferior, and makes it hard for me to ask for advice. Also makes me worried about presenting any in progress work or ideas, as they may be deemed not good enough and reflect on my standing in the competitive environment. Okay. This seems like a well-defined problem. Okay, so now we're putting on our solutions hat. Throw out anything. You can speak or you can write it in the chat. Any even crazy things, right? Like one crazy thing is ask the person to leave the lab, right? We're going to cross that off later, but that, you know, ask competitive person to leave the lab. Other ideas, other solutions. Talk to the competitive person about being kinder. PI about the dynamics. That's right. The PI might not realize the dynamics that are happening here. Oh wow, a lot of solutions. So wait, can't even keep track of the chat. Let me make this window bigger. Okay.
Jamie is emphasizing anonymity. I think that's also a very good point, right? There could be repercussions for talking about another lab member.
Mm-hmm. Confront person one-on-one. Leave the lab myself. Avoid the person as much as possible. That may not be possible in all situations, right? Lab meetings, etc., but as much as possible. Weiji, you were that person in the past? Oh my God. Everybody grows. I mean, this is important. This is important. We grow and change. Okay, talk about differences in backgrounds. And perspectives and how these affect projects. I want to say here, I want to add to this one, talk about different, maybe, yeah, encourage respect for different perspectives on lab projects. I'm thinking, you know, if I were the PI and a student came to me with this problem, first of all, I would be really happy. Well, I wouldn't be happy that there's a problem, but really happy that they came to me and I learned about this, because you might not notice, even though it's happening all around, you might not notice if you are the PI, for instance, because maybe your self-esteem is not tied anymore to, you know, this kind of competitiveness, and you basically might not know that this person is shutting up everybody else. You might think, well, other people are shy. I have one outgoing person in the lab. I'm so lucky that someone speaks, at least in lab meeting, and it's not just like all quiet. And you don't realize that it's because this person is speaking that everybody else is quiet.
Or they behave differently in lab meeting than in conversations with other lab members. Yeah.
Exactly. You never know what's happening in the lab offices when you're not around. The other thing is seeing these solutions, seeing, you know, leave the lab. Obviously, you know, hopefully we're gonna cross this off, but immediately it comes in the hopefully, wait, this is such a problem for you that it makes you think you want to leave the lab. That elevates this for me. This is not just, you know, a small gripe of this is making me a little bit uncomfortable. This is a serious problem. So I'm already learning a lot as a PI from reading the solutions that are coming up. Okay, create anonymous. Oops. Create anonymous and use for providing feedback. Yeah, that was Jamie's. Practice meditation. self-talk to remind myself that I don't care to be competitive, to compete with this person. I'm riffing a little bit on what you wrote here, Kayla. First, reinforce your communication with your mentor, feel more confident, and then the next step is to share your worked out in a more general environment in your lab. Right, so this could be have a lab discussion. Competitiveness and lab environment, and where we want to be. It could be that this person, realizing they might not know, right? Like what you said about himself. And when that comes up, is like, what are our lab norms? How do we want to talk about stuff? Do we want to compare each other ourselves to each other all the time? Do we want to talk about what, high level profile, what, like if your paper was in a high profile journal or low profile journal, or do we find that, that's destructive? When the norms are explicitly discussed, people automatically adapt to norms. So if this person didn't know that they are basically outside the norm of the lab, this could be helpful. A discussion like that could be helpful. Okay, so I have here written to me directly another out-of-the-box solution, but let's write it because we're writing everything. Sabotage their work. Make their experiments fail.
I have to admit that was one of my ideas, but I didn't dare to write it.
Everything goes. The fun thing about this, if you can laugh about it, if you can start to make it a little bit of a joke, it also
went together with punch this person in the face, but I thought it was a bit too much.
You seem so peaceful, Vero.
Yeah, I'm very peaceful on the outside, but inside.
Okay. Discuss with others in the lab to see if this is a general pattern. Brainstorm ideas for dealing with peer pressure in the lab. Okay, I see that there are like 20 more messages. So I think I'm not going to get to all of them. Like this will be too slow if I go through all of them. Can people, if they have something that like short sentence that I could add here, can you unmute yourself and just say it? I'm a slow reader.
I see one that I like here, or I'm not sure if I like it, but it's worth discussing. Like, become more competitive yourself and use them as motivation to reach some goal.
And to add on to that, maybe also that just realizing that the competitive lab partner might be very insecure about his or her own work, and that to not try to judge where they're coming from, and just stay focused on what you're doing and be helpful.
I like the example that Daniel put in about try and collaborate with the person, involve them in a project with you.
Yes, especially collaboration may be able to help us to learn the ways in which this lab member became successful. So it's actually a learning process as well as a collaboration.
I like that.
And they can learn from you how to be nicer.
Maybe they will automatically be nicer when they'll be collaborating. I like this idea that maybe they might be insecure. They might be lonely in the lab and feel like this is their way to communicate and to, people who are lonely and who have difficulty with kind of creating social connections. We'll create social connections in all kinds of ways. And young kids in like elementary school, they'll make trouble. They'll be the class clown as long as, you know, everybody notices me and I'm not transparent and like air, or they will hit someone. You know, Vero said punch in the face. They might punch you in the face because they feel so invisible. This is, you know, in 2nd grade and 3rd grade. As adults, people who have problems with creating social connections as children can grow up to people who have problems creating social connections as adults. And this might be their, you know, their go-to method. What I do is I compare us. At least I'm in that equation. I'm not invisible.
Yeah, and maybe relate. There are also systemic factors, right? There's some home environments and school environments and entire cultures that sometimes encourage this level of comparison.
Yeah, which is again why I think talking about lab norms and saying, you know, we come from very different cultures, very different backgrounds. This is what do we want our lab to look like? What do we want this community to look like? Let's create that together. Could be really useful. So should we start erasing some things off this list?
Punch them in the face.
Okay, let's erase that one. So I'm gonna do that. There's some way to
Also sabotage their work. I think these are systems that can give you a bit of satisfaction for a fraction of a second, but definitely don't solve the problem and don't teach you anything.
How do you do add a line in the middle of text in Google Docs? Why am I not finding that suddenly?
I think you
Sorry,
can
Mom.
use
I'm
Command-Shift-X for the strike through.
Command-Shift-X. Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Asking the competitive person to leave the lab. I, as the PI, am going to erase this because obviously that's not going to happen. And
Leave the lab myself. Get rid of that one.
I, as the PI, am going to also cross that one out. What was it? Command-Shift-X. If you're not crossing that out as the student, I'm going to cross that out for you. Not an option. What else do we want to cross out?
I don't know if meditation really solves the problem.
Okay, so maybe for me, like I'm the student or you're the student. Yeah, that doesn't solve the problem. So let's erase that one.
Avoiding the other person seems unrealistic.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to go back and forth? Is it okay to go back and forth to the defining the problem as well? Because
Sure.
it depends, like it also depends on the lab environment and whether you feel like your PI wants to have a touchy-feely conversation about how everybody works or not, because that might be a bit of a non-starter.
Well, so the PI might erase this. You know, I'm assuming that you're sitting and doing this with the PI. So the PI might say, you know, I'm not the kind of person where we can have a a lab discussion. This is not my kind of thing. And then you might want to add, well, you know, maybe we'll do this in our office or something like that. If I were the PI, I wouldn't cross it off because I believe in talking about norms and expectations. So I'm going to leave that since I get to be the PI right now.
I would also say become more competitive myself might not be the best solution, right? Because like we're clearly dealing with somebody who's not entirely well adjusted and who's creating negative feelings in others. So you don't want to become a part of that problem.
And I think also the student who came with this problem, the competition is hurting them. The competition is hurting their self-esteem and their ability to work to their fullest extent in the lab. So telling them, well, just, you know, lean into it and become more competitive, that seems a little bit dismissive of the problem.
Yeah, there is a real legitimate philosophy that you are motivated by sort of negative feelings about your own inadequacies, but I think it's always very masochistic.
I would also, as a PI, encourage in my lab, I would encourage crossing off discussing with others to see if this is a general pattern. This seems a little bit of like discussing behind this person's back. So it encourages some kind of gaining up on this person, thinking that they might be insecure and might have feelings of even being invisible. Like that just makes it even worse.
I would cross self. This was likely to be the first thing came to my mind. So
You
if
would, we
self-talk
lost you.
too.
Okay, self-talk.
If this worked, there would be no problem, right?
Right. It seems like this person ups the ante whenever you kind of can ignore a little bit, they up it even more, right? From the initial description of the problem, that this becomes more and more pervasive. So that seems like this kind of solution is not enough for this problem, which again makes me think that what we got to in the end about that person, the competitive person, actually being the weak one in this story in some sense, and that's why they up their game all the time to prove that they're better. That might have been onto something.
Yeah, so there's one solution: confront the person one-on-one. That might work if you have amazing people skills and maybe you already have the respect of that person to some extent. But yeah, it's not good for every trainee in every situation.
Yeah. So maybe one solution to add from this while erasing that one is ask PI to have a similar problem solving session with the competitive person. Maybe asking the PI to talk to them and say, there's a problem in the lab. How do you see it? Will bring them to realizations and will shed more light on what is the issue here. And maybe you don't want to do that with your peer because you have too much to lose, especially if your peer is a little bit like they're a postdoc and you're a graduate student, something like that. But the PI can maybe do that. Hopefully the PI has the skills to do that.
Yeah, one more, like the brainstorm ideas for dealing with peer pressure in the lab feels like what we're doing right now, but doesn't feel like as a solution in itself.
Yeah. Okay.
I also propose the adding of another solution, which also depends on maybe background differences. Maybe this direction is just not for you, and maybe going in another direction in the lab would make your background useful and also make you become a more competitive member. So I think switching directions.
So so I understand, who switches directions, the competitive person or the person who is doing the problem solving right now?
The person who is doing the problem solving. Because I feel that this competitive culture does not only matter within lab, but also affects opportunities people have after they get into the labs. So even if we solve this problem inside the lab, the person may still have insecurities about job prospects, about academic positions that he or she and this competitive person may eventually end up competing for in the near future.
Where the competitiveness is moving through. So that's a really good point, and a new one here, that maybe the problem was ill specified or not the right problem. This is the problem that the person came with, but through the discussion, we realized that maybe the problem is something else. Maybe you're having a really hard time with your project, and so you feel this competition all the time. But if you really look inside, that's the problem that we need to solve. And we need to scrap all of this and start with like, okay, I'm having a really hard time with my project. What do I do with that? So, if we were doing this in real life, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 solutions here, which is kind of too much. We would then want to maybe choose our top 3 or our top 2 or even 1. But we have a long list to choose from things that haven't been crossed off. And I think definitely for me, this list is, when we started, I didn't have a lot of ideas on what to do here. And a lot of them came through making this list. So of course we're, 40 people here making this together. But even with 2 people, you'll find that the list especially if you give it time, let it grow, let the list, think more ideas. We're not starting to cross off until we have at least 10. We don't end at 3, right?
Are you saying here that, I mean, in principle, this model is for problem solving between the mentor and the mentee, but you could, as a mentee, also do this by yourself, right? If you just take lots of practice, no?
I would think to do it between 2 people at least.
Yeah.
If the problem is, it could be if there's a small project group, they could all do it together. But what I'm saying is when you're writing the solutions, there's this, okay, we wrote down the 3 things that come to mind. We're tempted to stop here. No, force yourself to put down at least 10 solutions before you start crossing off, because you saw our creativity started, like the new things started later, after 10. Great. Anybody want to say anything more about this problem? Insights that you have from the process?
I have a question about it's the expectations about this meeting. Is this going to be like a single, like one-time session where we do all 3 steps, or is this going to be like a multi-session meeting?
It's a one-time. I do it in one sitting. Yeah, immediately, you raise the problem, you define it, you raise solutions, and you cross them off. But the whole thing can take half an hour or 40 minutes or, but yeah, definitely do it in one go. Or at least that's how I've always done it.
I really like this problem solving process because at the beginning, I think when we're defining the problem, it kind of started off with like, oh, this is one lab member that is making me feel bad. But then as we were coming up with solutions, we saw that the mentee also there were solutions that prompt the mentee to also take some responsibility, like to be more assertive or to find ways to, be upfront about the problems they're having. So I think it helps us to see the problem in a different perspective, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, it helps to verbalize things and to, explicitly consider them. I think beyond, and maybe I've said this already a couple of times in different ways, beyond the solutions that you get, the whole process is useful in just going through the issue and communicating about it, rather than just fermenting with it and just being emotional. I mean, not just emotional is really important, but with your own emotions, you might be upset and annoyed and angry with this person, but these specific solutions bring a different aspect to the problem, which is not just this is super annoying to the point that sometimes I think I want to leave the lab. There are a lot of ways to think about it. And it's also, it's educational to the PI, it's educational to the student. It's, it will help the future lab of that student or future group, wherever they are leaders in their life. Yeah. Should we do one more problem?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, I have 3 more problems that came in the anonymous forum. Let me choose one of them, just a second. Weiji, you can provide filler conversation while I do this.
I wasn't prepared for that, but yeah, I learned a lot from this. It's just always amazing how many things you don't think of, even though you think you have exhausted all the options. Yeah, and in my case, when I was this competitive person, I think I was just very immature. Like I had grown up with this idea that like you have to compete to be worthy of anything, and yeah, I had to some extent just grow out of that. That's not really a solution for the problem solver here. Like allow the person to turn 25 or so, but yeah, that's probably what happened to me.
Okay, I have another problem. Let's Control Enter, start a new page. How do I start a new page here? Command Enter, there we go. New page. Before that, before the new problem, someone was wondering if I or anyone else here have thoughts on how to bring up this kind of technique if your advisor does not seem that open to problem solving with you to begin with. Maybe because they're very busy or they're generally unapproachable or have very set ideas on how mentoring should be, etc. or maybe it's just not applicable in that case. That's a tough question. I mean, this is a technique that is not like, they give us that in the manual to how to be a PI. Well kept secret is there is no manual to how to be a PI. Nobody tells us anything. Definitely they don't tell us this. And it's also, I don't know how common this technique is. And even if it's called the problem solving technique, that's how I learned it. But so I called it that. But like, I don't know if you'd find this like, with a quick Google search.
I would say you could do this technique with any friend or other lab member, right? And in fact, some of the solutions that came up involve talking to the PI. So that implies that your conversation partner, your problem-solving partner might be somebody else than the PI.
I was going to say that you can also teach your PI something. You can say, hey, I went to this growing up in science, and they should use this method, and it's really simple. This is how it works. These are the rules. You do.
I love that.
You throw out the problem, you define it, and then you throw out at least 10 solutions. They could be crazy, they could be anything, and then you cross off those and then any person has the right to cross off whatever they feel is not going to solve the problem. Let's try it. I mean, your PI may say, no way, but I don't know. If your PI is that close to ideas, I doubt there would be a PI in science. Maybe I'm being really optimistic here, but I think people are generally, scientists have to be to some extent open to ideas.
I think I like the idea for problems generally, and maybe even sort of like scientific problems. Like I have a problem with this aspect of the project, with this progress in my project. But yeah, I feel like there are a lot of people who I know, probably including myself, who would find it very hard to bring a discussion like this. I feel this about this situation to the boss, just because I just haven't got the feeling that that's something that they feel like is part of their job.
Yeah, well, there might be, okay, so that's a very fair point. There might be someone else who can help you with that. So someone on your committee, dean of graduate studies, someone who can sit with you, who feels that this is their job. As Weiji said, you might have to resort to doing this with a friend or with a lab member to come up with ideas that you can implement without your PI's involvement, or even ways to get your PI involved. And I also liked your idea of starting this off with something kind of more concrete and easy, like a problem I'm having with my project. Let's do problem solving on that. And there too, you could be creative, like, we completely scrap the experiment, do something different, or we do this, or we get someone else, or we talk to this other lab and have them collaborate with us. Like, there are all kinds of solutions when there is a problem with the research itself. And maybe that's like an easier climb. Wow, that worked really well. Maybe next time I have another issue that I want to problem solve about that is more kind of interpersonal in the lab. And maybe we can try that out. So you can kind of model it first on something that's less emotional. Although problems with projects are emotional too. Just maybe less emotional for the PI. Also might be emotional for them too, actually, as I say that.
Totally.
Okay, so problem number 2. So I'm going to.
If I can just add something on what you just said. So because let's say I had a similar issue, and sometimes we think that the PI is not ready to have this conversation, or you feel that that's not going to happen, they're going to shut down, but sometimes they're just not used to that, or simply they never had such a conversation. And if you start it, you might be surprised at what comes out of that, and it might also be a very good point for them to learn something and do better in the future. So of course, if you don't feel like approaching them with maybe a personal question, that's totally okay. But otherwise, you can try, maybe, of course, starting a bit more general, but it's also good for them, I can tell you.
You can even include this as part of mentoring up, which was our previous mentoring.
It's great, yeah.
Mentoring up in science. So kind of saying, this is what I need. Mentoring up was all about not mentoring your mentor, but about saying, this is what I need. What I need from you right now is that you help me solve this problem. And I have I have an idea of how we'll do it. let's, set the, like we solve other problems, like we solve a problem in math, we write the problem and then we like go through the different derivations, which here is going to be the solutions. And then we figure out, some methods might work better than others. So we cross off the ones that don't work. Okay, so our new problem. I can't finish writing grants and papers in a timely manner. I get too overwhelmed. I fear I will disappoint my mentors with half-baked or poorly articulated ideas, so I miss deadlines. I lose on opportunities to get valuable feedback and improve. The more I extend the deadline, the more pressure I put on myself to deliver a better product. This is such a common problem. Such a common problem. A lot of people here probably relate to it in different ways. If anybody wants to elaborate a little bit or add more to the problem, although it's pretty well defined here, that the way I see this problem happening multiple times is exactly that when you extend the deadline, you also extend the increased expectations. If I didn't meet the deadline for the first draft and I moved it closer and closer to the deadline for submission of the grant, then my first draft must be, now I think the expectation is that my first draft be very close to a final draft. It should be really perfect. It's not only with writing, this happens even just with meetings. I've seen this in internship, but not internships, in rotations. We say, okay, let's meet in 2 weeks. And then the student says, well, I haven't done much, so let's postpone it by a week. But now they feel like, well, now I have to have like 3 weeks work 3 weeks worth of work to present. But of course, I didn't do much in the first 2 weeks. I'm not going to do 3 weeks of work in the third week. So let's postpone it again. At some point, it's such a mountain, like we're just never going to meet because the expectations are too high. So so for that one, I can just tell you, this is not the writing one. I now tell people, especially when they're doing rotations, because it's so hard to do something in rotations in the beginning. I say, let's meet. Even if we just say, hi, how are you doing? How's this week been? Just so that we don't increase the pressure, so that we don't have like a month before our first meeting and that meeting becomes so oppressive. But what do we do with papers? I'm happy to hear both elaborations of the problem, but especially solutions.
One elaboration of the problem is that it doesn't stop when you become a PI. That's just a side note.
Yes, absolutely. There's self-expectations and there's expectations of others from us, and it just continues.
Make it sound so appealing.
Wow. So as appealing as it is to
the good sides too.
But there are solutions. Okay. So some solutions are coming down. Okay. Write down daily schedule. Find time. So what I've written so far is give up on research. If I can't do this, then I won't succeed. It's one of those Hail Mary solutions. Talk to the PI about level of doneness that is useful for them to give feedback on. I think that's a really important point of coordinating expectations. Ask the PI what their expectations actually are. This is very similar. Set earlier deadline and keep to it no matter what. Even if a bullet point list of ideas. I added that because saying just keep to it is not seeing reality of like, if you could just keep to it, you would just keep to it. So it has to be no matter what, even if like there's not much stuff going into that. Okay, what did Vero write here that I see that, oh my God, on that? Oh, that was it. Yes. Create a social context. Okay. That's basically create a social context that will help with accountability. Yes. Set up intermediate goals. That's so helpful to set up intermediate goals. And you're like, oh, I need to have a paper written, or I need to have a grant written. That's just a mountain too high to climb. Routinely discuss the writing with the PI. For instance, someone in the lab, with someone in my lab, we decided that we were going to devote the first 5 minutes of our one-to-one meetings every week to just talking about updates on the writing of the paper, because the paper is kind of like happening in the background. There's more research that we're talking about, but we're going to talk about that in the beginning, not at the end, because in the end we might not get to it, in the beginning of every one of our meetings, just to make sure that that keeps moving along. Needing to co-write in a group, that we already have a similar. Send intermediate product to PI on deadline with explicit list of what I am stuck on. What is holding me up? No, what feedback I want. Yep. Get a writing coach. Maybe I have, and this is not outlandish at all, I have specific fears about feedback or showing unfinished work to my PI, because they're, I'm trying to, they're going to write recommendation letters for me, etc. Like I want to impress them. I don't want to show the unfinished side of things, but I can get a writing coach who is not my PI. That'll be way easier to do this intermediate work with and to get their feedback. And in fact, they might be experts on writing where my PI might not be an expert on writing. So this is like solving so many things at once. On the one hand, I come to my PI with a like really nice finished product. On the other hand, it's, well, not on the other hand, and that project is way better than had I not had a writing coach. And maybe that writing coach is not like, a professional writing coach that I pay for. Maybe it's someone in my lab. Maybe we can each coach each other, because actually it's so much easier to improve someone else's writing than to improve your own. It's quite amazing how spotting mistakes in others' work is very different from avoiding those mistakes yourself. Set up a consequence. Monetary. A symbolic field loss if you, not symbolic, but I mean like, not huge loss if you don't meet the deadline. I sometimes reward myself with M&Ms. So you can do the opposite. You can kind of punish yourself with, and people do that. One of the labs here used to have a jar where they had several people whose names were similar. Jeremy, Jason, they all started with J. And so they had the J jar. If you use the wrong name for a person, you put a quarter in there. And after a while, they bought like a big lunch for everybody with all the quarters from the J jar. Cut yourself some slack. Yeah, lower your bar. What is acceptable? Okay, again, we're at the point where there are quite a few more. Oh, nobody said this before, but how about therapy? Yes.
I love that.
Oh, sorry?
I think that's a great addition.
Yes. A lot of our inhibitions around writing they're real, and they are self-protection mechanisms, because our writing is where people are going to criticize us, right? Like literally it's going to go to anonymous reviewers whose job is to criticize us. But that is where, you can have all your ideas in your head, you can do all your projects, you think this is where you put it out to the world for them to crush your ideas, or to, tell you where you're wrong, or expose your errors. Now, obviously, they'll also say that it's good, but like what we're afraid of is that they'll say that it's bad. And it's this self-protective, like, I can't bring myself to write. It's not because I can't write. It's because I don't want anybody to read my writing and tell me where my research is not perfect. And so at different degrees, like it always needs some kind of therapy. Some of that therapy can be, self-talk and reminding myself that nobody's perfect, et cetera, and definitely I'm not perfect either. And that research is never right. It's just, this idea is worth something, so let's get it out there. It can help others. And if there are problems with it, then someone will elaborate on it. I'll give someone else another project to do. So I'm helping the field. So you could do some of that self-talk, but sometimes you need to do that talk with someone else. And if the problems are very deep, then, again, what is the real problem? It's a problem that you can't write, or the problem that you have very deep insecurities about your work and about getting feedback from others.
Yeah, totally.
Read about how to tackle perfectionism. Yeah, sometimes reading what other people have done to solve this problem. I mean, as I said, this problem is so common. You could get ideas from that. Fail faster. What is the MVP approach, Daniel?
So minimal viable product. So there's like this kind of more agile approach that you have something and then you improve this, but not wait like until this is like really perfect something, but you have something and you discuss this, you improve that, you see maybe it doesn't work, so you switch to something else, but you don't wait until you have really something that is perfect.
I guess that's an approach that's very much more common in industry, and in academia we have sort of the opposite tradition where everything has to be perfect, and that can become very extreme sometimes.
So I want to add to that something that I've used when I have problems with writing, because I do. And I was told that this is what writers do, what authors do. They have this phase where you just throw down ideas on paper. You just write, like for an hour or two, and you're not allowed to look back. You're not allowed to edit your own writing. Like if you want to, if you're thinking, well, I should have said it differently, just say it different, like, write it twice, whatever. You only write linearly for a couple of hours. And then you come back the next day to edit it. That solves the problem of an empty page. Empty pages are really, really scary. So now I don't have an empty page. Editing for me is so much easier than writing. And often when I come back to it, it's not that bad. Actually, it's pretty good to start with. So you can throw down ideas on paper without looking back and editing. you can even force yourself to submit that to someone else, knowing that this was just my ideas without editing, and asking for the relevant feedback, right? Like, don't edit my commas here, but tell me, what do you think about these ideas, the order, things of that sort. Okay, are there things that I missed? I missed like about 10 of them on the way because I jumped to the end. Is there something that I should write down here that is different from what we already have? Speak up, please. Oh, I see here, keep your work in a shared folder from the start. Shared folder from the start. So it doesn't seem like there's this big unveiling when you finally submit it. Basically, your PI is not going to look at it because they don't have time either, but they could have at any point. Unless that, now we get to cross things off. So if you, as the person who brought up the problem, any of you could be the person who brought up the problem, or all of you could say, well, for me, that wouldn't work because that would mean that I wouldn't put anything in that shared folder to start with. So for one person, this would be a solution. For another person, this would just aggravate the problem.
I would like to ask one thing. I mean, I think it was like already like partially like said in like this therapy or this perfectionism, but so to allow to myself to fail. So it's I mean, this is something okay. This is not like the something that I need to avoid for all the costs. So it's.
Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, something like 20 solutions. So that's a great time to start erasing some. And maybe it's 2:11. We don't necessarily need to erase these now. You all get.
Plus, it's really hard to erase anything. I think this is a great list.
Yeah, but for different people, different ones might work better. So maybe maybe erasing, some of them we want to erase, right? Give up on research, we're going to erase, but maybe it's sometimes it's more productive to just think, okay, which are my top 3? I can tell you that in my lab, and for me personally, setting up accountability is fantastic. If you're having problems writing, so this is now going to be like an aside from from problem solving technique, but to this specific problem. So research shows that lowering kind of the expectations, but in terms of, not in terms of the deliverables necessarily, but in terms of how much time and space and mental space you need to write, really, really helps. So if you write for the research is on half an hour a day, half an hour, that's it. If you write for half an hour a day, every day. So the study was one group writes as normal, which is kind of binge writing. It becomes harder and harder as you become busier to find those binge times. And so you barely write. But so that's the kind of that was the control group in a sense, the writing as usual. Then there was one experimental group that was asked to write half an hour a day, every day, ideally same time of day, like let's say first thing in the morning or last thing in the day. For me, first thing in the morning works, and with my cup of coffee, kind of to condition yourself to that environment in your same sofa or wherever you do it. And the third group wrote for half an hour a day, and at the end of, they had accountability. At the end of the week, they sent an email to somebody about what they wrote this week. And then they counted at the end of a year, this is a long experiment, they counted at the end of a year how many publishable pages they wrote. Publishable in the sense that, if you write a 10-page grant, you're not going to publish it, but it's publishable quality stuff. And I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it was something like, I want to say 30, 60, 180. It was like, the 30 is the writing as usual, twice as good when you write half an hour, only half an hour a day, and 3 times more than that when you just write an email to someone at the end of the week.
If we can find that study, we can post it on the Grow Science website.
Yeah.
Or to this video.
I can look for it. I know who told me about it. It was years ago. It was in our we have like a 1 day. So I said we don't get a manual for being a PI. We do have a 1 day orientation. It was in that orientation. They told us this. I remember it blew my mind. Maybe I multiplied everything by 3. Maybe it was like 10, 30, 90, but it was still, you know, that kind of thing where accountability really helps. Writing for half an hour every day really helps. If you try this technique, which I highly recommend, you can make it a little bit more than half an hour if you want to, but the idea is not to do too much. So I try to write 1 hour a day. The idea is not to do too much, because if I write for one day, I write for 3 hours and then I'm like, okay, so now I don't need to do tomorrow or the day after it. That ruins it all, because the whole point is to do it every day. You get really used to getting into it and getting out of it. It like that hurdle just like goes away. You just come in, like I write to myself, I made it to here, or like, here's the idea that I was in the middle of, I make a little comment on the side and I go straight into it the next day. And then what happened to me is I have my writing time is 9 to 10 a.m. And every day I would kind of start late, I would get to work late, I would do all kinds of things late. And it wasn't really 9, it was 9:15, 9:30, 9:45, and 10 already my meeting starts. So I have a hard stop. And so now I have an accountability group. We actually have a silent writing Zoom, and it's done wonders. So we just, you know, we're on the Zoom, we say good morning in the chat, and then we're all writing from 9 to 10. Some of them are on the West Coast, which really shames me into starting on time because they're doing it at 6 a.m. Anyway, highly.
Can I join that group, Yael?
What? Sorry?
Can I join that group?
Yeah, you can. You can.
Just kidding. We can talk about it later.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great. It's made me go through a backlog of years, and I have no backlog now, which is just unbelievable. So I highly recommend that. Good luck with your writing. Good luck with your problem solving. I hope you don't have big problems that need solving, but if you do, that you can use this technique and teach your PIs and teach your colleagues, and you know, we can make this a more commonly known technique and useful when needed. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much, Yael, and thanks everyone for coming. The next Growing Up in Science global event is going to be in February. The announcements will be on the website. Take care.
Let me stop sharing the screen.
Okay.